When he was deprived of the succession to the States of Parma, and his name had been taken away from him, it became necessary to provide for his present and future position. By an edict issued in July 1818, he received the title of Duke of Reichstadt, which was the name of one of the estates in Bohemia which were to form his appanage. The same edict settled his armorial bearings and gave him precedence immediately after the princes of the Austrian imperial family. Another deed had 6 months previously conferred upon him the property of Bavaro-Palatinate fiefs in Bohemia with reversion to the crown of Austria in default of male issue. He was only to enjoy the revenues of these estates on reaching his majority or on his mother's death, this princess being obliged to provide for her son's maintenance as long as the duchies of Parma, Piacenza, and Guastella remained in her possession. The poor child never came to the enjoyment of this estate, for death awaited him at his majority. Thus the Emperor of Austria, although he was very fond of his grandson, gave him nothing. Marie Louise provided largely for her son's expenses and the cost of his education. Count Dietrichstein was the Emperor Francis's consent appointed his tutor. His masters were learned and distinguished men who gave to his precocious intelligence the development to which it was prone. Count Dietrichstein, who came to Nice for the sake of his health during the winter of the years 1831-1832, frequently conversed with General Bertrand's daughter about Napoleon's son. The gist of his remarks was that the young prince was tall and well-made, that he resembled both his father and his mother, that he had not the simplicity and the good nature which are the basis of the character of the Austrian archdukes, but that he had a great distinction and dignity in his manners, that a touch of melancholy and a habit of meditation had left their impression on his features, that he was well informed and had a taste for serious studies and for the military state, that he had retained a recollection of France, although he had left it in his early childhood, and that he took pleasure in seeing French people, which revealed itself by the animated attention with which he looked at them and tried to recognize them. It does not befit me, added Count Dietrichstein, to boast of a young man whose education I directed, but I may say that my efforts were seconded by the very best natural dispositions, and that the Duke of Reichstadt is a man. 6 months later, this young prince was no more. It was on May 6th at 10 o'clock in the evening that I took my last farewell of the Empress. She was much touched on this occasion. She was good enough to express her regret at my departure and said that she felt that in future all relations between her and France would cease, but that she would always remember this land of her adoption. She charged me to assure the Emperor of all the good wishes she wished him, and told me that she hoped he would understand the unhappiness of her position. She repeated that she would never consent to a divorce, that she flattered herself with the belief that he would agree to a friendly separation, that the separation had become inevitable, and that no change had occurred in the feelings of esteem and gratitude which she felt for him. She presented me with a snuff box ornamented with her cipher in diamonds as a souvenir, and left me to hide the emotion which was mastering her. I myself left her with a heavy heart and in a state of veritable affliction. I left on the morrow at 6 a.m. with my traveling companion. I met Baron de Vincent at Enns on his way to resume his functions as ambassador at Ghent with Louis XVIII. On the way from Vienna to Munich, I met with conveyances full of recruits, with the cavalry corps in march, together with artillery regiments and parks. The headquarters of Prince Hohenzollern, commanding the First Corps, were at Stockach. Prince Eugene was at Munich, which I passed through. He was there in so equivocal a situation that I avoided seeing him for fear of exposing him to some unpleasantness. He had, besides, warned me, begging me in secret not to visit him on account of the supervision to which I was subjected. The postmaster at Waldsee told me that Prince of Neuchâtel, Berthier, had passed the day before in company of his princess and an officer on his way to Bâle, but had returned a few hours later, having been forced to go back to Stockach, and that he had made his way to Bamberg, from whence he had come. I arrived at Bâle on May 11th at 6 a.m. I separated myself from my traveling companion there. I had nothing but praise for the way in which he had treated me during the journey. he had exercised a mission of protection over me, rather than of supervision. On the frontiers, at the forts, and in the various stations of the Allied troops through which we had passed, he had preserved me from the annoyances of visits to and appearances before the civil and military authorities. I found the people of Bâle much disturbed by the battery which had been constructed at Huning, which menaced the bridge and town of Bâle. I saw Monsieur Harel, extraordinary commissioner of police at Bourg-Libre, or St. Louis, and found him very distrustful of their feelings towards us. From that city to Paris, I met with an enthusiasm for the emperor and an ardor for the war, which I cannot describe, not only amongst the soldiers and the fresh recruits, but also amongst the majority of the people. At Belfort, I was called upon by the chief of the staff of General Lecourbe, who had his headquarters there. He came to us in Lecourbe's name to ask with great anxiety whether I brought the news of the speedy arrival of the Empress and her son, and if there was reason to hope that the war would not take place. I met the loyal Monsieur de Marmier, the Emperor's aide-de-camp, on my way. He had raised a free company at his own expense, and he asked me the same questions with the keenest interest. I was expected with impatience by the Emperor. I went anew to the Élysée, where he had established himself. I was introduced into his room immediately after my arrival, and I found Napoleon there seated on a settee, with his head leaning on his hand, wrapped in profound meditation. He rose to receive me and took my hand, which he grasped with great cordiality. Then, opening a glazed door, he preceded me into the garden, where he kept me till 6 p.m, overwhelming me with questions of every kind. He told me to return on the morrow at his levee. I arrived just as he had finished dressing and followed him again into the garden, where his questions recommenced. These conversations lasted several days. The levee usually took place at 9 o'clock, but it was often 11 o'clock before the emperor thought of leaving me to attend it. When I fancied that I had exhausted all the subjects which seemed to me likely to interest him or to satisfy his curiosity, he found means to extract fresh details from me by searching in the innermost recesses of my memory. I will not endeavor to transcribe these conversations in the form of a dialogue. They were an exchange of questions and answers of infinite variety and detail, and turned on the most of the things of which I have spoken higher up. Generally speaking, the subjects of the emperor's conversation on these occasions were serious and seemed to affect him painfully. He rarely dropped a grave way of speaking. One day, however, after having listened to certain particulars on the empress's domestic life, he asked me in a jesting tone whether one of her uncles had not paid her attentions. Napoleon spoke to me of his son with great tenderness and listened with marked emotions to the most insignificant particulars about this darling child. All that he said about the Empress was full of respect and consideration for her. He pitied her for the trials to which she had been exposed, anticipated whatever I had to say in her favor, and expressed no doubt that her feelings for France and for herself had been forced. He ordered me to write to her so that the weak thread which still connected Marie Louise with France might not be severed. I informed the emperor of the order given me by the Emperor of Austria to delay my departure until I had been summoned by Prince Metternich. I told him of the strong reasons which I had for thinking that the object of this audience, although I had not been told so, but which I could suspect from certain half-confidences, was a pacific one if subsequent events should bring the Austrian cabinet to make an overture to the French government. I told the emperor that having waited for this audience for a month without its being brought about by any occurrence, and seeing precious time go by, I had feared lest it might be indefinitely postponed. The cabinet of Vienna, of its dispositions grew more favorable, could easily find an intermediary and charge him to carry its offers to Paris. I had therefore thought that my place was at the emperor's side, and that my return to France would be more profitable to his interests than a prolongation of my stay in Vienna, were it only to carry the news of this incident to his ears. Napoleon approved of my conduct. He considered that the delay which had occurred in the delivery of my passport had been occasioned by the confidential negotiations which had been established about that time in Bâle between Metternich and Fouché. It was one of Napoleon's secretaries who received these communications from Vienna instead of the emissary of Fouché, who wanted in this manner to act without the emperor's knowledge. Speaking of the princes who had been brought back by the Restoration, the most remarkable thing that the emperor told me was that in returning from the island of Elba, it was not Louis XVIII For this prince could not have kept himself on the throne of France for another 6 months, whom he had dethroned, but the Duke of Orleans. That he was sorry for this because this prince was the only Frenchman in his family, the most capable, and so on and so on. Napoleon was touched by the patriotic sentiments which had been displayed by the Duke of Orleans 2 months earlier when he had gone to take command of the Army of the North, placed under the orders of Marshal Mortier, with the letter which he had written to this marshal on returning into retirement, but above all, with the words which had been reported to him by Captain Athelin, one of his aides-de-camp, whom the Duke of Orleans had authorized to resume his post as orderly officer to the emperor. This prince had told him that a new invasion of France by foreign troops must be prevented above all, esteeming him happy to find once more the colors which he himself had only left with regret. The emperor judged the policy of the sovereigns and a great abnegation of his own interest. He considered it violent, but such as he was bound to expect, that it might have been more generous, for he had given them the example that the princes given over to the inspirations of the ministers were naturally led to make a bad use of prosperity. He told me that all that was happening could not in consequence surprise him, and that it was in the nature of things that in making his attempt he had understood that he could appeal only to the courage and patriotism of the nation and to his sword. And for the rest, he added with a melancholy smile, God is great and merciful. All his words were stamped with a calm sadness and a resignation which produced a great impression upon me. I no longer found him animated with that certainty of success which had formerly rendered him confident and invincible. It seemed as if his faith in his fortune, which had induced him to attempt the very hardy enterprise of his return from the island of Elba, and which had supported him during his miraculous march throughout France, had abandoned him on his entry into Paris. He felt that he was no longer seconded with the ardent and devoted zeal to which he was accustomed, and that, hampered as he was with the shackles which he had allowed to be placed upon him, he was no longer as free as formerly. The emperor, after his first curiosity had been satisfied, prompted by his natural kindness, could not fail to attend to my personal affairs. He was the first to speak to me of the kind of occupation which would suit me best, and encouraged me to express my wishes on this head to him. One of the Napoleon's ministers, remembering the example of Monsieur Augier, Secretary of Commands to Marie Antoinette, who had been at the same time treasurer of the city of Paris, thought that this latter function, the holder of which had provoked the animadversion of the government by his exaggerated royalist fervor, should become the appanage of the secretary to the commands of the empress. This lucrative post was occupied at that time by the son-in-law of Count de Ségur, Grand Master of Ceremonies, and as this circumstance prevented me from desiring it, I did not entertain the proposal. In the course of one of his audiences, the emperor told me this arrangement had been mentioned to him, but that he did not think that a financial post would suit me, and that he intended to entrust me with the postmaster general's place as soon as he found some other employment for Monsieur de Lavalette. He added that the general guardianship of the state archives would be the post in the administration in which my services would be most useful to him, that I could occupy it temporarily, and that he would add the title of Counselor of State to this post. On his departure for the army, he charged King Joseph to have a report and the draft of a decree with this purpose in view prepared. The events of the campaign of 1815 and the catastrophe which terminated them prevented any realization of Napoleon's kindly intentions concerning me. I learned in Paris that Monsieur de Talleyrand on April 2nd, 1814, in the midst of the cares which were caused to him by the enterprise of which he was the pivot, and which ended in the emperor's overthrow, and in spite of the multifarious obligations imposed upon him by the necessity of ensuring the success of all his intrigues, had thought of removing from the state archives all papers which were of a nature to compromise him. On the day after the Emperor Alexander's arrival at the mansion in the Rue Saint Florentin, Monsieur de Talleyrand had charged 2 persons on whom he relied to go and explore the archives of the Louvre, and on some pretext or other to examine the cases or boxes containing letters, notes, or reports emanating from himself or addressed to him concerning the trial of the Duc d'Enghien and affairs in Spain, as well as the documents which might cast a light on the abuses of confidence or money questions in which he might find himself implicated. As soon as the report concerning these investigations had been handed to him, Monsieur de Talleyrand, who had become head of a provisional government, made use of his power to appoint a Monsieur de Villers as chief to the imperial archivists. This temporary conservator naturally withdrew from the archives all the papers which were mentioned to him by the exalted person whose creature he was. When the former Minister of Exterior Relations under the Empire saw himself in possession of these documents, he burned them so as to destroy the proofs which sooner or later might have been used against him. As soon as Monsieur de Villers had accomplished his mission, his provisional function ceased. The desire to know whether the return of the Empress and her son could be hoped for was general. So great was the anxiety on this point that all the persons with whom I came into contact overwhelmed me with questions. Fouché, in his capacity as a policeman, was the most inquisitorial. He wanted to know what had happened in Vienna during the last year. He urged me to come and see him. I had no inclination to do so because this minister had always inspired me with an invincible dislike. I told the Emperor of the way in which he had pressed me to come, and he advised me to see him, but to listen to him rather than to tell him anything. I went to his house, and after his first questions, he said to the Emperor, speaking with his usual assurance, "Well, there it is. It was not he who was wanted, but he can't be removed as you remove a pawn from the chessboard. We will see what we can do to keep him." These are the exact words which he used. I reported them to the Emperor, who knew no doubt what to expect from him, for he contented himself with shrugging his shoulders in sign of his contempt. Fouché's hearty words agreed with what he had been told on my return to Paris of his mysterious understanding with Prince Metternich since the Emperor's return from the island of Elba. Communications had been exchanged through a secret agent with a view to concerning the Emperor's dethronement in favor of his son. I was surprised that Napoleon, after the discovery of treachery so flagrant, should have kept Fouché at the Ministry of Police. I learned in my conversations with the Emperor that he had been informed by the Duc de Vicence Caulaincourt of this new intrigue on Fouché's part, and that he was acquainted with his previous intrigues as well as with the mission which he had given to Monsieur de Montron behind his back at the same time when the latter was sent to Vienna with dispatches from the Duc de Vicence. It was only later that I learned, and Monsieur de Strasser himself confirmed this, that a communication of the same nature had been addressed to the Emperor by his intermediary, simultaneous with the dispatch of Monsieur Werner to Bâle. A fortnight after my return to Paris, I was present as a simple spectator at the ceremony of the Champ de Mai, during which the acceptance of the additional act to the Constitution of the Empire was proclaimed. On this occasion, Napoleon presented the Paris National Guard and the Imperial Guard with eagles. The deputations of the army received their eagles 3 days later in the Great Gallery of the Louvre. The additional act was greatly criticized, and yet this act contained more liberal dispositions than the charter which was granted by Louis XVIII. I, for my part, regretted this isolated act which opened the door to all kinds of polemics and passionate discussions at a time when it was the first need of France and of the Emperor to face the enemy. It would have been, we consider, better to have postponed to quieter times the elaboration of a new constitution for the situation in which the French nation found itself in the spring of 1815 lent itself more than ever to a continuation of the dictatorship, and the danger which was menacing the country at this time made everybody feel its necessity. These reflections, considering the additional act, give me the opportunity of mentioning in what terms Madame de Staël expressed her approval of it. These are the very words which Napoleon's persevering enemy wrote to King Joseph from Capet. The additional clauses are all that France needs, nothing but what she needs, and not more than what she needs. Your brother's return is prodigious and surpasses anything that one could have imagined. I commend my son to you.